All right, officially given it the minute, and we have a lot to cover today. So without further ado, I wanted to welcome everyone to this webinar of the Beneficial Use Learning Network, focused on designing constructible projects. So my name is Adriana Zito Livingston. I work for the Nature Conservancy's New Jersey chapter, and it's my privilege to lead the Beneficial Use Learning Network, supported by a number of colleagues from many organizations and agencies. So since our numbers continue to grow, and I think that's a wonderful thing, I wanted to take a few moments here at the beginning to describe this learning community focused on beneficial use of dredged material for restoration of salt marshes and their adjacent habitats. So as I said, I work for a TNC in New Jersey, and our adaptation team is focused on advancing the practice of sediment addition for marsh restoration, because it has the potential to be a scalable way to keep marshes in place for wildlife and people. So this learning network, as I said, is a collaborative effort with a shared goal of advancing the practice of beneficial use for ecological restoration by sharing on the ground lessons learned from projects that have been planned and implemented. The network is steered by an organizing committee, with representatives from many organizations. I won't embarrass myself by trying to list them all, but I am very grateful for the support that I received from our many federal, state, and local NGO partners. So it's really been a very encouraging process as we all learn and share about this technique and all of the experiences we've had so far. So we have a lot of power together in this learning exchange process. We've had wonderful engagement as well from our regulatory community, from our navigation management community. So it's not just conservation practitioners. We're a group of conservation practitioners, coastal engineers, many of whom have joined us today as panelists, our nav managers, and regulators. So we're hoping to have an effective and efficient conversations together through this learning network. So just a couple of housekeeping things. I really appreciate that everybody is already on mute, and many of you are off video, which is fantastic. It actually saves on bandwidth. We are going to ask that folks stay on mute unless it's the participant, unless we call on you for the participant question portion of the program, which will come at the end, or obviously our presenters, panelists, and speakers. If there's an issue that you need to raise, feel free to message myself, Laura Kerr, or Catherine Gannon, and we'll help you navigate those. I'll ask everyone to introduce themselves in the chat. We are thankfully 47 people. That would take us a while to introduce one-on-one. So please, in the chat, indicate your name, affiliation, and geography if your affiliation doesn't imply geography. A little bit about the program today. We're going to begin with a quick overview and framing from me, and then you're going to hear from the experts that you're all here to learn from. So they're going to speak for about 10 minutes each. So we have a wonderful panel of engineers. Ron Moen, Mike Morano, Katie Perkins, and Chad Sumner are all here to share their various perspectives. Then we'll follow that by a moderated discussion, initially with questions that have been drafted by the organizing committee, and then leave time, as I promised, for your questions. So at any time you can add questions in the chat, and we'll log them for that participant portion of the program. So without further ado, I'll kick us off on the overview. So I just need to make this bigger so you guys don't have to look at me squint. So as we continue to discuss beneficial use projects in coastal systems, in particular marshes, in marshes, there appear to be really three generic types. So one of the biggest challenges in sharing the learning or having these conversations is there's no beneficial use is really an approach to restoration, not any specific restoration technique. So as we try to think about engineering, designing these projects and implementing these projects, regulating these projects, it feels like there's three kind of generic types. And again, gross overgeneralization, but I'm going to try to at least take us from beneficial use for marshes to a couple of themes that we're going to try to hit on today. And then I'll ask our panelists to try to address, especially, we know there's not a one size fits all and that every site is different. So, So before we dive into how these projects are designed, it's important to name those three types. And we'll, like I said, we'll be trying to touch on those or ask our panelists to touch on those as they're able. So broadly, sediment has been used in 3 ways. So to stabilize the edge of salt marshes, to add a little bit of elevation to a marsh platform. So that's really looking to enhance existing habitat and design so that existing plants or plant communities go from struggling to thriving. So those are situations where I shudder to use the word thin layer placement because I know it means different things to everybody. But so those thinner projects where the expectation is really that plants will survive or very quickly recover. And then there's a third type, and I think that's the one that's most challenging, but it doesn't mean it's not worth doing because there's a lot of resilience, application, and forward thinking that can happen. So adding a lot of elevation to a marsh platform or rebuilding platform habitat where it had been lost, or even putting it in a new place. So that habitat conversion, whether we're talking island creation, converting an interior pool or an unhealthy pool or a mud flat, to low marsh or marsh platform, or building high marsh into our systems. So this is the type of project where you involve thicker sediment, that involves thicker sediment placement and the acceptance that existing vegetation is going to be smothered. And so then vegetation is going to have to be either naturally reestablished or planted at that new elevation. So I've invited our panelists with a wide range of experience designing and implementing beneficial use projects. I don't think I had an appreciation for how diverse their skill set was before I saw their presentations today. So I'm very grateful to have such capable engineers here to speak with us on designing these projects. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Laura to start sharing her screen and we'll go through our presentations. Perfect. So we're going to start with Ram Mohan. I'll ask him to introduce himself, and then Ram, you should be able to have control of your presentation.
Perfect. Good afternoon. Can you all hear me okay? Thumbs up. Perfect. Excellent. First of all, kudos to organizing this kind of a BU learning network. It's great where similar minds can come together and share lessons learned. I'm happy to be here today. During my talk, I'll give you a sprinkling of different kinds of projects, some regional, some national, and pick on a few things with respect to design and construction. I am a principal at Anchor QEA, a consultancy. I am in Delaware physically. I work very closely in New York, New Jersey, Maryland, and nationally as well. And I'm also an adjunct professor at Texas A&M and the director of their Center for Coastal and Dredging Studies. And I also sit at the National Academy of National Academy of Sciences Marine Board, where we look at national coastal resiliency issues. And I will also mention in my previous life, I was the chairman of the World Organization of Dredging Associations, which is the marine trade organization that deals with dredging and marine construction worldwide. So I will dive into the slides directly with that. So the first project I highlighted is a project we're working with DNREC on. This is the Assawoman Wildlife Area, sediment dredged that DNREC is planning on dredging is planned to be used here. One of Delaware's largest restoration projects. And we have identified 3 cells pretty much that vary from anywhere from 16 acres to 53 acres, each receiving placed material in the range of ½ a foot to a foot. And Adriana mentioned the different definitions of thin layer placement. And we actually have a national guidance that I'm co-authoring with the Army Corps ERDEC group. And that'll define what the pictures you're seeing here with respect to nozzles on the right side. That's an innovative nozzle design we used in Brunswick, Georgia, to place fine sediments on which turbidity in the effluent is a major concern. And the picture on the upper side is a work we're collaborating with ERDEC on the 7 Mile Island in New Jersey, where we are trying to develop the sediment distribution pipe. So it's essentially a pipeline with different holes cut in so that natural material sorting will happen with the fines discharge at the end. So we're trying to minimize pipe moves if you look at an area like this. So in this project, as well as any project in the Mid-Atlantic, if you had your wish list, all the things I've listed there are the must-do items you need to have. You know, topo bathy, typically not older than 5 years. Sediment types, the bearing capacity of the marsh is important because that'll settling and bulking and shrinkage all affects final elevations. Sea level rise is a tricky topic. I usually advise that we don't look at it more than 10, 15-year range because the data uncertainty is significant past that point. And last, monitoring of all these things, you know, the plant form, the hydrology, the circulation in the post-constructed marsh, as well as abundance and diversity are all important to fold into ideally a 3 to 5 year monitoring program. I know Catherine's going to talk about poplar. I'm going to take us back in time, early 2000 when I was involved. We were initially looking at this cell 3D in Poplar Island that you'll hear more. The only thing I'm going to focus here is the importance of modeling. So we did modeling in 2 different aspects back in 2000 in the early planning stages of Poplar Island. One was how much do you need to place this material so that it'll settle and give us the elevations we need that were determined from reference marsh surveys. So the high marsh along the perimeter, the target range is about 4 to 6 foot. I'm sorry, it was 2.5 to 3 foot. To get that, you needed to place 4 to 6 feet based on consolidation, predicted consolidation using the PSDDF models. This here is a depiction of the hydrodynamic model that essentially simulated. This is where the spillways, these are the, I actually cannot see this. I'm going with my pointer here, but the green on the right side is the inlet, the spillway that'll be open up post-construction, which will become an inlet to the constructed wetland. The points on the upper and the lower corners on the left side are the inflow points. That's why the channels are cut there. They're initial dredging channels. So basically working with site management to design the project as you go through. The next one I highlight here is the project in New Jersey, Shooting Island. So again, this project you can see on the upper top photo, the island has been drowning, creating compounding to the flooding issues in the back bay of New Jersey, and in this case, city of Ocean City. And the photo in the inset is really the living shoreline system that we designed. And essentially this breaks the flow and the waves on the front side, thereby promoting natural accretion behind those features. And then on the back end, you cannot see it very clearly. We have oyster castles that are meant to trip up the smaller waves that come in. Again, the design factors here are all the hydrodynamic coastal processes, wind waves, currents, and then within the interior of the island itself, at some future point, we hope we can place dredged material and take care of those pooling you see in the inner surface of the marsh. So now let's move on to Texas. So this is the same time frame. So Poplar Island and Galveston Bay Islands are, along with Sonoma Baylands in California, are the 3 major projects everybody should look at to learn from the initial large-scale beneficial use thinking. So Galveston Bay, we had an interesting, monitoring data. If you look at the picture on the left, it's green. You would assume it's great. When we had reviews with NOAA, they didn't give us a very colorful review. The problem was the vegetation was too dense. So just because you have vegetation doesn't mean it's a success. You need to plant them with considering, what the eventual uses, the benthic species and fish and other, crabs and other species have to be able to use them to travel through them. So if it's too dense, you have a problem. On the right side, this is the evolution of the Atkinson Bay, Bolivar Bay marsh system. Initially, it was designed as a single island on the right side. What you see on the outside edge of that picture is what they call cheniers in the Gulf, which is essentially isolated islands that were adaptively designed so that waves will break through them. And you get this added resistance as you go through the constructed system. This is a combination project. This is one of the largest living shorelines in the country. It's about 10 miles. It's called the Mississippi Living Shoreline System. Overall, it's 16 miles if you count two different projects. But what you see on the foreground of the picture is the living shoreline. It's barely visible at high tide. So it is meant to be tripped by storm waves. So it's not meant to be a breakwater. Behind it, we hope natural accretion will occur. What you see, a little dredge on the inside of the picture, if you look carefully, and that's dredge is actually constructing the marsh, and about 50 acres of marsh restoration. And then we had about 45 acres of strategically placed underwater reefs that was meant to be habitat. So again, another evolving concept in terms of how we take this kind of restoration. So like Adriana said, we can either enhance the marsh platform, you can restore it, or you can construct a new island. So all of this, different variations of this. The last piece I'll focus on is really the concept of strategic sediment placement. So this has been promoted very heavily by the Corps in San Francisco, Bay Delta region. And the thought is you can let nature do its work. So by strategically placing these materials along the points where we mark north, middle, and south on the picture there, that's where the sediments are going to be placed, and the storm currents and the natural currents eventually will disperse those into the wetland cells on the right-hand side. You see by those yellow arrows, those are the receiving wetland cells. So nature does its own work. It'll take a while. In this case, you know, we did a model to say how much of the material will eventually go there and how much will be lost to turbidity. And the results were very promising, as you can see in that figure there. And finally, I just wanted to let you know there is this nature-based solutions engineering with nature guidance. You can find it at that website down below. I strongly encourage you to take a look at that if you haven't. There's a 150-page executive summary and a 1,000-page document involved, like almost 100 different agencies to put this document together. But it basically goes from initial planning, assessing risk when you default to nature-based shore protection systems and other features, to all the way through design and how monitoring and adaptive management completes the do loop by feeding this, you know, lessons, evolving lessons that you then apply to the next design project. So that was all I had, and I'll stick around for questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Ram. That was an amazing tour of a wide variety of projects. So thank you for kicking us off with that. Next, I want to introduce and invite to turn on his video, Mike Morano, who works with WSP, and he'll introduce himself. He is a contractor with NJDOT. So thanks, Mike, for joining us today.
Thanks, Adriana. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Morano. If you don't know me already, I have about 30 years of civil engineering experience. The first 21 was spent doing transportation improvements, bridge replacements, interchange improvements. And then since about 2013, I've been working nearly exclusively with the NJDOT Office of Maritime Resources. That started with the recovery of the New Jersey coastline from Superstorm Sandy. And that evolved into the NJDOT State Channel Maintenance Dredging Program. The first project I'd like to talk to you about was in the Fortescue Marsh. The image to the left is the picture of our great state, and Fortescue Marsh is located on the Delaware Bay side of the state. The image on the right is a close-up of the project area, and which is a much larger portion than which we actually placed. Our project area was only kind of in this area here. Some project partners were the Nature Conservancy on this project and the New Jersey DEP Fish and Wildlife Service. It served the navigational maintenance dredging of one channel, that's the Fortescue Creek State Channel, placed about 8,500 cubic yards of fine grain material on the marsh. about 21,000 cubic yards in a protective dune that was about 1,100 feet long and about 100 feet wide along the front of the marsh, which actually complemented and protected the more sensitive areas on the interior marsh where we had placed fine grained material. And then about 7,600 cubic yards in total between two different beach placement areas. One was a non-bathing beach which can accept about 75% sand, and one was a bathing beach that could take about 90% sand. Some of the lessons learned that with this project is that placement options are good. When you have valuable material, the ability to be able to place them in different areas and keep the dredge production as high and as efficient as possible is good for the project and is good for the contractor. So we had available areas to place coarse grain material and available areas to place fine grain material. One thing that was good about this site is it had about 4 to 5 feet of tide swing, which also lends for a much more forgiving environment. So if material stacks up after a particularly heavy night of production, a large tide swing will take that material and move it around before it's gotten consolidated and put it where it should go, where Mother Nature wants it to go. This was one of the very first projects in New Jersey, so it was very scrutinized by the regulatory agencies because we didn't really have a whole lot. We haven't done it a whole lot in the state, so it hadn't. Everybody was kind of conservative, so it spec'd out a lot of containment. And also, this was one of our first projects that was designed, and we spec'd out a large distribution network. What that did was force a lot of construction equipment, although it was low ground pressure, onto the marsh platform that maybe incurred more impacts than we needed. The containment, it was about 22,000 lineal feet of containment that was required to encompass this site. So there was a lot of activity on the marsh that we've learned may incur more impacts than actually needed and didn't really provide as much benefits. Next project I'd like to talk to you about is the beneficial use placement in Good Luck Point Marsh. That is on the mainland of New Jersey, on the Atlantic coast, on the Bay Shore, immediately west of like Seaside Park, Seaside Heights area. That was a maintenance dredging of 4 channels. Some of the project partner on that project was the Edwin B. Forsyth Wildlife Refuge, which is a national wildlife refuge. We placed about 4,000 cubic yards of fine grained material on the marsh and about 8,000 cubic yards of coarse grained material in the near shore berm. This is the marsh placement area is shown on the far right. Near shore berm is shown in section view. We enhanced about 5.2 acres of marsh and about 750 lineal feet of near shore berm that was placed. Some lessons learned were, if I go back one and annotate, bear with me, I'm a rookie at this. In this area here, this is the near shore berm area, and that is the point. That is Good Luck Point right there in the Barnegat Bay. So we placed material in a berm without any kind of containment or training dikes or anything, and just let the coarse material flow and kind of move the spill barge along the length of this in this permitted placement area. And what had happened was very soon, either during or very soon after the placement, a nor'easter came through and moved that sand just right offshore. So one of the lessons learned was to know the project area and have a good, a better understanding of the currents and the risks of, it's kind of hard to predict what a storm's going to do, but maybe do a little bit more of modeling in that area, kind of know how we could better place that sand to stay in place. The image to the right was an impounded salt marsh. There is a Bayshore Avenue is located here immediately to the east. The Barnegat Bay is also further to the east. And then this has a very, very small micro-tidal environment, like a 6-inch tide swing. The hydrology of this site is only supplied by two twin 15 pipe culverts in this location and a 36 to 48-inch pipe culvert in this location. So it's not very forgiving. If you place material in a mound, it's going to kind of stay there on this site. And one of the things that we did learn is, as you can see in the picture in the center bottom, is we had to move the inflow pipeline around in order to get good sediment distribution. And one of the added benefits that was found out, that the contractor found out, is that, you know, as that pipe moves around, that actually kind of worked as a level and can level out some of the higher mounds as the sediment was placed. Next project is a project that's in development now, and that is the Popular Point project. The image to the right, you can the bridge that's in the upper right is the Route 72 bridge into the Long Beach Island. So we're just immediately south of there. Project partners there are the Edwin B. Forsyth National Wildlife Refuge. Again, they own thousands of acres on the New Jersey coast that can use sediment and BU projects. And that development immediately to the north of the project area is Beach Haven West, and that's in Stafford Township, New Jersey. And those lagoons have a large amount of maintenance material that needs to be removed. So they may be ending up donating some material for beneficial use for this project as well. The image to the right there, there's marsh enhancement and shoreline stabilization. There are about 4 to 5 state channels that have a dredging need in the area. It's predominantly fine-grained material, except for one of the channels. And the image to the right kind of is a heat map of the fill of the entire site. It's about 125 acres of the marsh proper. If we do find some coarse grain material, we have the design that's kind of shown in that middle image there, where there is a very low level stone sill, and that's to help with wave attenuation as well as to retain the coarse grain material. Offshore, that follows that yellow alignment. And then there's about 16 acres or about 60 to 65,000 cubic yards of coarse grain material that proposed beach area can house if we do find or have coarse grain material that needs to be beneficially used. And then the orange outline is a protected dune similar to Fortescue, where you have a good sound shoreline stabilization element to a marsh restoration element behind it, which provides added protection and benefit. Project status right now is permit submissions coming up this fall. Dredging and placement, hopefully summer and fall of next year. And some of the goals are to combat sea level rise and shoreline erosion, help protect that Beach Haven West community, restore productive and protective marsh and wetlands, and restore the shoreline back to the approximate 1977 extents. That's the light blue line that you see in that center image there. And then the last project that I'd like to present to you today is the dredging of the Windport Access Channel with beneficial use in Abbott's Meadow Wildlife Refuge. That's on the Delaware Bay side again of our great state of New Jersey, as shown in the left image, and on the right image is a close-up of the project area. Project partners in Abbott's Meadow are also the NJDEP Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the New Jersey Economic Development Authority. Main element here is marsh and habitat restoration. Again, it'll be a cutter suction pipeline dredge, typically much larger than what we're used to in the shallow draft navigation on the Jersey Shore, since it's about up to 1.2 million cubic yards of material that may be used on this site. So it'll be a larger dredge. There's about 330 areas right now identified for restoration. And some of the status and some of the goals are the permit submission is coming up in fall of 22. Dredging completion needs to be complete by December 31st, 2023. And because of the sheer size of this site, as well as the size of the dredge that we anticipate that may do it, there'll be some adaptive management activities through the spring and summer to try and maximize the habitat creation on this site. One of the main goals is to restore habitat for sensitive bird species, including the black rail and possibly the Saltmarsh sparrow. And again, restore the wetlands and restore some diversity. If you see in that image to the left, there is some green, but it's mostly mud flat, and to restore high marsh, low marsh, and some upland. Thanks for your time. I'll be available for comments.
Really appreciate this tour of New Jersey projects, Mike. I'm digesting, and like I said, I had a preview. So thank you guys. Thank you so much for sharing this project. Next, we are going to go to Catherine Perkins from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. She is going to share with us on Poplar Island. So Catherine, you should have slide control. Oh, I'm sorry, you're voice controlling with Laura, my bad.
Yes.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm Catherine Perkins with the Army Corps of Engineers, Baltimore District. I'm the project manager for the Poplar Island project. And I'm going to spend a few minutes giving you some background on the project and tell you our overall process for wetland restoration. And then we'll get into some of our lessons learned from wetland design and construction over the past 20 years. Next slide, please. Poplar Island is located in the mid-Chesapeake Bay, and it has a fascinating history. It's currently located about 15 miles south of Annapolis in the Bay Bridge and about 35 miles south of Baltimore. In the 1800s, it was an inhabited island. About 100 people lived there, and there was a full village with a church, school, post office. And over time, due to erosion, by the 1930s time period, many of the full-time residents on the island began to move off to the mainland of Maryland. And by the 1990s, there were several remnants of Poplar Island left that totaled less than 5 acres in size. Next slide, please. In the mid-1990s, the Army Corps of Engineers partnered with the Maryland Port Administration and determined that an environmental restoration project utilizing clean dredge material would be an excellent way to provide placement for dredge material and also restore remote island habitat in the bay. So this is an environmental restoration project. That's how it's categorized, but we do have 3 goals that we treat equally. While we're restoring habitat, we also are optimizing site capacity, and it's receiving dredge material annually from the Maryland approach channels to the Port of Baltimore. And our 3rd goal is to do no harm to the surrounding environment. Next slide, please. Poplar Island is currently at its full final size. It's about 3 miles long, and it has been restored to more than 1,700 acres total. The goal is to develop 50% of the site into uplands and 50% of the site into wetlands. We've had about 20 years of experience. The first wetland was restored in 2003, and you can see that was a smaller site, about 25 acres. And then we've had 8 wetland planting design contracts since then. And our most recent was in 2018. And that was our largest site to date, was about 85 acres. Poplar Island is broken into these various cells that you see here to make it easier for them to be developed and constructed. Each of the wetland cells receives about 1 million cubic yards of material. And I should also mention this is a contained site. It's constructed, the perimeter is constructed of armored sand dikes, and then the dredge material is hydraulically placed into the inside of the cells. My experience, I started working for the Army Corps in 2008, and I was the civil engineer that worked on many of the grading plans and wetland design contracts for 6 out of the 8 contracts we've done to date. And following that, I worked for 5 years as a project engineer, overseeing much of the construction of our recent expansion. And I am currently the project manager. So we've restored about actually 380 wetlands, 380 acres of wetlands to date, and we have about another 350 to go. Next slide, please. I wanted to share the general wetland cell development timeline because it is much longer and much different than many of these other projects that we're looking at. As I mentioned, each wetland cell receives nearly 1 million cubic yards, and that's typically inflowed in several cycles. So about 1 to 4 years is required for the dredge material inflow. And then next, please. And then there is the activity of dewatering the cell and performing crust management. And that's because the dredge material that comes in is unloaded and hydraulically slurried and then pumped back onto the island. So that's why that first picture you could see it's a high percentage of water. In years 4 and 5, we then have the channel excavation and the marsh plain grading. And then after about 6 years, we are finally ready to do our planting. Oh, and I forgot to mention that since the island is, the wetlands are contained, we do need to construct what we call tidal inlets. And this one shows some concrete box culverts, but we also have other areas where it is just riprap slope directly open, but that is done right before planting. We typically open the area up to tidal flow from the bay. Next slide, please. So when I talked to the team about what they thought the primary lessons learned were over the past so many years, we had 3 main categories: the elevations, the actual planting activities, and then contract administration. So first, to focus on elevations, next slide, please. We've heard over and over the absolute importance of getting the elevations correct. And we put a huge amount of effort into, surveying where the current plants are growing. When we first started, we looked at reference marshes in the area, but now we are lucky we have the advantage of having, several hundred acres of wetlands on site that we can monitor on an annual basis and see where specifically the high-low marsh break line is. And we have seen it creep up quite a bit over the decades due to sea level rise. We also spend a lot of time with our engineering team looking at the dredge material consolidation and settlement, and we do annual assessments of the material and the water content, and there's an exercise to estimate void ratios and determine which areas of our wetland cells are going to settle and which ones are more stable. And then we develop the grading plan based on coordination with our engineering team. We typically have several iterations of this grading plan, and our recent focus has been on positive drainage and minimizing ponding of water on the site. We used to have just a low marsh elevation and a high marsh elevation, and we would just do flat plains where the low marsh would be one elevation, then you would have a physical step up to the high marsh elevation. And we've recently eliminated that step, and we have probably for the past 15 years or so, we've really focused on building high. We often give the construction partners plus tolerances for the target elevations, but no minus tolerances. And yeah, so the tidal range, part of this emphasis is because the tidal range at Poplar Island is relatively small, and we have a pretty low level of room for error. If we have areas that settle, a couple of inches, that can be catastrophic for our plant success. Next slide, please. The next thing was the actual planting itself. When we start to do our concept design, we engage our partners very early. We just had a meeting 2 weeks ago for our next wetland design, and we presented a concept for planting that's going to take place in 2027. So we really try to start early and get feedback on what our research partners are seeing on the ground, both at Poplar and at other sites around the bay. One lesson that we've recently taken into account is always including high marsh around the perimeter of our site. And this allows the plants, specifically the low marsh, we typically plant Spartina alterniflora. That gives the low marsh room to move back and retreat to higher ground as we do see this increase in sea level rise. We've also had a recent focus on including more diversity of high marsh plants. And when we utilize woody vegetation, we try to use it in a way that we are working with the environment to create natural windbreaks for different habitat features. We also rely heavily on our contractors. When they arrive on the site, they'll spend a couple weeks observing the tides and recommending some tweaks or changes to our planting plan. So the biologists have realized that these are the guys on the ground, and that it's really helpful to allow the contractor to make changes in the design and recommend what they think would be the best for the overall success of the wetlands. Next slide, please. So as we've learned that as important as the wetland design is, the contract acquisition strategy and the administration of the contract is also critical. The Corps of Engineers typically uses technical acceptability criteria for these wetlands. We've found that rather than doing a low price contract or lowest bidder contract, that we've had more success doing low price technically acceptable contracts where we have specific criteria required for contractors to bid on the job. And this has been more successful for us than requiring warranties on the plant success. We also typically do multi-year contracts. The first year is for the contractor to collect seed and grow the plants. We usually do a nursery visit and are very involved in that first year process. The second year is when the actual planting and seeding takes place. And then the third year, we recently started having the contractor come back out to the site and remove any bird deterrent. And it also provides an opportunity for them to evaluate the plant growth and make any recommendations. And the third critical piece here is the requirement for detailed surveyed as-builts. We did about a decade of contracts where we have very poor records of exactly where the plants were put in the ground. And this has really helped us to, over the past 10 years, to require survey data and more detailed CAD drawings so that we can then come back 5 years later and see how the elevations are changing. So next slide, please. I thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you about Poplar Island, and I'd like to thank all of our partners. Over.
Thank you so much, Katie. I think there's a lot of ways to leverage the intense research and experience that you guys have at Poplar Island to inform some smaller projects. So I really appreciate your time in joining us today. For our final panelist, I would like to invite Chad Sumner from Sumco and Resilient Seas to turn on your video, and you should receive slide control in short order.
Got it. All right, thanks everybody. So I'm Chad Sumner, principal of Sumco Eco Contracting. Arrived at this discussion, started doing salt marsh restoration from the land side, probably back in 1999. Did some salt marsh hay farming, so became very intimate with the marshes there. 3 years ago, we launched a affiliated entity, Resilient Seas, which does hydraulic dredging, and a lot of the appeal for us in that respect was the crossover for this exact purpose that we're talking about, beneficial use of materials for marsh and ecosystem restoration. So that's just an overview of the diversity of the services that we get involved with, but obviously talking about beneficial reuse of materials today. So I'm going to focus on one project. This is the Narrow River Resilience Project in Narragansett, Rhode Island. In this case, Adriana, in the introduction, alluded to the 3 different types of marsh beneficial use projects. There's the expansion, the thin layer placement, thick layer placement. We called it thin-ish layer placement in a couple of iterations here. This project actually had all 3 of those. So I know it's not zoomed in very much, but you can see some gray areas within that bottom right photo that has number 1 and number 10. Those are the source areas for where the dredging was taking place. The black areas were areas where there was marsh expansion. So essentially areas that had around a foot to a foot and a half of water depth during low tide. This has a pretty gradual tide range here in this estuary. It's in the couple to 4 foot range. And then the other cells, the red encompassed ones and the blue encompassed ones, are where the marsh placement was taking, where the material is being placed on the marsh. This was kind of a dual purpose project. The dredge areas, you can see where the bridge is in the bottom right of that locus map. It's a high activity boat and kayak facility and channel here. The bridge at the top right, just to the right of that, there's a kayak rental location. So there's a huge amount of kayak activity in addition to powerboat activity. So public safety and recreational element was driving this as well in terms of expanding the navigable channels through that area. So that you could have both of those without them interacting quite as much as they had historically. So those are a couple of drivers of the job. And then as we got into this, this was, I believe, part of the Sandy Resilience grant funding. So this came through Nature Conservancy, Rhode Island, with a host of other project partners involved. And so then getting into the details of the project a little bit there, mentioned the folks involved. And so, yeah, let's start going through it. So on the marsh surface elevation, this is some of what they were starting to see, which is typical of marshes that are degrading. You get some water impounding on the surface, and that compounds itself with degradation of the marsh surface as the vegetation fails. You get the peat. In this area of Rhode Island, probably had 2 to 3 feet of peat establishment. As we get up into the Great Marsh area up in Massachusetts, we've got areas where we've got 8 to 10 feet of peat across the full tide range. So that degradation certainly was part of the factors we were looking to address. So we had the hydraulic dredging taking place and getting into some of the close-ups of it. This particular area is one of the marsh building areas. So turbidity curtain was fine grained sand for the most part. So we didn't have a lot of fine materials that were contributing to turbidity. The stuff settled out very quickly. As you can see, as we move through this, that excavator is sitting on, in some cases on timber mats, in some cases it didn't need to. Within a day or two, that size machine was sitting on this material. So clearly not a fines type situation. This was sandy material that settled out and built up pretty quickly. So in addition to managing the discharge of that material, it was grading off to the design grades of the marsh system. So this was actually, this area was contiguous to what they called Sedge Island, which was a marsh and upland area on the island side of that channel that we saw in the overview initially. And then on the marsh surface itself, placement on the marsh surface ranged from 1 foot down to a couple inches. Part of what, if we were looking back at the original overview of it, the focus was starting on the upland center part of the marshes to maintain positive drainage towards the existing channel. So all of those outlined areas had tidal creeks that were associated with them. So we're trying to stay out of those and certainly clean those up as we were moving out. But this one was not so much a, hey, we need X number of thousand cubic yards to fill the entirety of these marshes to a certain elevation. It was, we have so much material coming out of the channels, start in the middle. So there were designated placement areas depending on the stationing of the channel. So designated marsh cells. So we started in the middle of the cells and worked out as far as we could from there. So you can certainly imagine there that if we were targeting a certain high marsh elevation, started in the middle, hit that target, and then as we ran out of material, that feathered off. So we ended up with some areas where we have that thicker placement and some areas where it petered out into the last little bit of slurry that moved out of the material. But as you see here, we had mini excavator on the marsh. I believe we have another shot where we had this, yeah, we'll come back to it. We also had a low ground pressure skid steer for just grading off any areas where that stacked up. But overall, the intent here was certainly a uniform placement within the areas that were receiving the dredge material. As part of the containment and shoreline stabilization, in addition to the expansion, so this is the Sedge Island as well. And that bottom right picture, if you look past the excavator, is where the expansion was taking place, but the near side is also where the channel came through. So there's a really steep bathymetry in that location. So there's some erosion taking place on the edge of the island. So in addition to building off the back, they wanted to stabilize the front edge. So it's a combination of treatments there. One thing that was interesting about this project is prior to this effort for a number of years, the Nature Conservancy did some pilot studies along the area of marsh up by the canoe and kayak facility, where they did some coral bank stabilizations, they did some shell bags, geotextiles, they did a host of test edge stabilization measures. And the issue here really is because we only had that 2 feet of peat, it was underlain by sand. So with all the boat traffic, part of the edge degradation was the sand was getting washed out, and then the peat would fall, and then sand would wash out and the peat would fall. So they were really just trying to stabilize that sand layer beneath the peat against the erosive forces. And so there's a couple of different treatments, rock, shell, it was actually shell bags and oyster shell bags, and then the core logs. And as you'd imagine, the core logs disappeared within a year or two and were not a long-term solution. You're not going to get vegetation growing below that range. So when we came out to do this Sedge Island, the treatment involved there was the shell bags, in addition to on the surface, some chokestone sill. So that's after completion. You've got that chokestone material. We actually blended some of the dredge material into that just to promote some future natural recruitment of vegetation. And those triangles are the shell bags that were intended to interrupt flow there, trap some sediment between those triangular points and add to that shoreline over time. Love our environmental work windows in the Northeast. Generally, I think the joke is that if you abided by every available window, you wouldn't be able to work. So this is the one that tends to be the one that's, for whatever, from a endangered species and fishery standpoint, the least disruptive to them. You just hope for not too many of those days from an operator standpoint, and also results in shorter days. So certainly a challenge working around the time of year that we face there. There's an additional section of the Sedge Island where it was just the shell bags, no stone mattress treatment. And then particularly in the new construction area, as well as the thickish placement areas, there was volunteer planting of those areas. One of the things, and we'll get through the lessons learned, I think are coming up, that this came to challenge a little bit with, is because the fine sand settled so densely, they had some issues with the new plant establishment. So that is still something we're working through. A couple other things that I alluded to coming through it is the pilot treatments. Core logs, obviously not something that's going to be a sustainable stabilization measure below vegetation range. Sometimes they're used either at toe slope between high marsh and transition zone into coastal bank, or in areas where there may be a step in grade between high marsh, low marsh, depending on how folks are approaching that. I mean, I certainly, from our experience, agree with how USAC's been dealing with Paparotti and not having a step. Either way, if there are core logs, that's where they would tend to go. And the shell bags will probably end up using. Marsh Island edge treatment, we saw the pictures of those. marsh placement, we didn't really require an edge treatment. As I said, we kind of stayed back from the edge of the channel. We were starting in the middle and working out, and net of it was that the amount of material available in the channels wouldn't have overflowed to that edge anyway. And then on the material placement itself, that fine sandy material did stack up a little bit. Again, saw what was happening when we were executing the expansion. That stuff drained and settled up pretty quickly. So that's where we had the low ground pressure skid steer and excavator supplementing some of that placement. Then went through the rest of those. So upside there is because it was fine silty or fine sand. The turbidity curtain was pretty much all we needed for containment in those building areas. And the upside certainly with that material type was being able to drive on that material within that first day. So that's the gist of that run. Saw a lot of really compelling elements of what we're looking at from beneficial reuse placement. There have been a couple others up at Nigrit facility that Brennan completed last year, and then for Nature Conservancy also under Sandy, not a dredge material placement, but a finished layer placement at Statuus Point National Wildlife Refuge was an upland borrow source that came from one of the towns had some sand material with shell material in it, and similar type of thing, but placing over a 12-inch and down, requiring planting as well. So open to questions and looking forward to getting into the moderated discussion.
Thank you, Chad. I really appreciate that deep dive on this Narrow River project. Lots of compelling elements. And I think you really hit on one of the themes, right? So it's really about, there's these different features. So the larger the project, the more likely we are to have some of those multiple features, right? Some finished placement, some thickish placement, some habitat recreation. And I think that's where we get into the complexities on design, but also regulation of these features. So I'm excited too to get into our moderated discussion. I will ask all of our panelists to come on video. So everyone that just presented, plus I'd like to introduce Scott Douglas from NJDOT to introduce himself, and then I will, once Scott has introduced himself, I will introduce our moderator.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for inviting me, Adriana. So I'm Scott Douglas. I'm the Dredging Program Manager for New Jersey DOT's Office of Maritime Resources, and we're responsible for maintaining safe navigation in the 200 nautical miles of state channel that runs from Sandy Hook to Cape May, as well as a bunch of other things, but that's relevant for today's discussion.
Thanks, Scott. I'm glad to have you on the panel. And then I'd like to introduce Tom Harrington. So Dr. Tom Harrington is with Monmouth University and New Jersey Sea Grant. He is also joined, along with Laura Kerr, a facilitation team for the Learning Network. So I'm really grateful to have Tom's mind at the lead of this moderated discussion. So Tom, without further ado, it's all you. So we're gonna do like 20-ish, 30-ish minutes of panel discussions, but I wanna encourage everybody, all of our participants, this is the time to start queuing up your questions in the chat, and we'll get to those on the half hour is my goal. So Tom, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Adriana. And first, I'd like to thank all the presenters for excellent presentations and really stimulating ideas that are going to be hopefully quite useful for us to learn from. It's really interesting the scale of projects you've presented, everything from Popular Island, which is a large core scale project that we're familiar with, to small marsh restorations. And I just wonder, as an initial question, as designers and engineers, at what point are you brought into a project like this by either the land owner or management, conservation management groups, to initiate that design process? And how does that partnership work? And I leave it to anybody who would like to answer.
I can start, Tom. That's a great question. So I think it varies across the board. So it is, it really depends on the particular project and the project owners and sponsors. I can give you an anecdote of why getting the designer early in the process would be a smart thing if the project permits that. I've kind of critically looked back at certain projects, and at least one or two I found that the project owners initially negotiate conditions of restoration that may actually work against nature. So this would be agreeing to build, let's say, pick a system like Chesapeake Bay, a marsh system that's predominantly high marsh and has a low percentage of low marsh, when in nature it's just the opposite. So that sort of input, it's not only engineers, it's ecologists and scientists and everybody that works together. So it'll be nice if in those working group kind of settings, that kind of critical scientific thinking is brought in. Otherwise, it could be painful to go back and renegotiate those project goals.
Thank you. And Scott and Michael, you've worked together on a number of projects. Has this been a ongoing relationship, or how did it start?
I can start.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Scott.
No, I just going to say we started our relationship with WSP and Mike from the very beginning, and I always find that it is from concept development straight through to implementation that we like to have our design team involved. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Mike.
Concept development usually is right about the time when the designer gets involved. Typically, it's a either an NGO or a wildlife manager that has a site that needs material, and then they'll contact the DOT or looking for material or send out the feelers for material. Once there's a candidate site, then that's the best time for a designer to get involved so that we can gather as much existing conditions information as possible. As informed as we can on what's going on there today and why it's failing. We'll make inform the design as we go forward in designing the improvements and combining that with our maintenance dredging project.
Yeah, and if I can just sort of wrap that around, really, if you're thinking about these projects, there's really, you need to have both a resource partner and a navigation partner, unless you're going to borrow material, which is hard to do in New Jersey. There aren't many places where you can borrow material from in the Back Bay without running into habitat destruction issues and impact issues. So if you're going to be doing these in New Jersey, you really need to be looking for a resource manager who has a project site that needs material, and then working with those of us who have material that we need to dredge. So it's a triumvirate. So the resource agency, the transportation agency, and the design engineer, as well as your contractor. The contractor a lot of times ends up being low bid, but you heard the Corps mention that sometimes it might be good to have pre-qualified folks who've done this kind of work before. Some of us can do that, some of us can't, but it's a good idea if you can do it.
And that was where I was going to jump in by saying usually not soon enough or early enough in the process. And it's some of the handcuffs that public agencies involved in this have, which is they have a design, bid, build, public regulation, procurement process where they contract with the engineer and they design everything, and often informally we get questions or brains picked a little bit, but it's nothing that we can formally contribute to. Some of the upside that we do see through the NGO and some alternative delivery mechanisms are potential for an earlier stage involvement, whether it's straight up design build from the beginning or taking things from a permit stage through, here's what we want to do, how are you going to approach it, building that kind of stuff into the permitting process so that there isn't a guessing going on, and then the contractor shows up finally post-bid, pre-qualified or not, and says, hey, it really would make a lot of sense to do this. And the answer is, crap, we just permitted it this other way. So now we got to go back to the drawing board. So certainly, I think, particularly in light of what we all see coming down the pipe with infrastructure funding and a big glut of activity that is insufficiently staffed at permitting, engineering, construction, public works, everything to digest all that. Anything that can streamline that process, whether it goes through NGOs or getting folks involved earlier, is certainly a benefit to any of these efforts. And also to what Scott says about needing to align placement with source. One upside of most navigation channels is that at the core level, sometimes it's every year. At the state level, it might be every 5 to 10 years, but just because we missed it this time doesn't mean we can't be ready to do it next time. So if we're really looking at marsh placement, then it's getting the regulatory and design process on board to have those placement sites ready the next time it comes around. But we know when they're coming, right? We know where those channels are being maintained. So it's just a matter of getting those ready to go.
And Catherine, I suppose it's a little different with the Corps, and that you're bringing in experts as needed. Are they Corps experts, or you also have partners external to the Corps?
Oh, we have a lot of external partners. I would say most of the experts are outsiders. But it did pique my interest about, we have a new project coming online soon called Mid-Bay Islands, and we are trying to not do the same mistakes that we did on Poplar Island. And one of the biggest ones that Ram alluded to was, we had originally, the permit for Poplar Island requires the wetlands to be 80% low marsh and 20% high marsh, which is very difficult, and something we have been working with our state agencies to try to change that for 10 years. And we think we're actually very close to updating it, but getting all of the partners involved early for the next project, the Mid-Bay Islands, they just wrote up the permit to be a range of, the low marsh will range from this percentage to that percentage. And I think that is such a better idea than to lock yourself into some exact percentage, maybe years before you even start building your wetlands. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a great lead into my next question, and that's, you've all mentioned it and danced around it a little bit, and that's sea level rise, and how sea level rise may be integrated into your planning and project adaptation. I think, Ram, you mentioned you're only looking at a very short-term window because these projects are made to be wet anyway. But how, as you look at, say, something like Poplar Island, where it takes 6 years from the time you place a cell to you actually plant plants, how do you look at adaptation of these sites in the long term so that they are able to be maintained and keep up with sea level rise? And who would be responsible for that? That's another question, I guess, for the group. Ram?
Sure. I can jump in. I was looking at Catherine too. I'm sure she would have comments on this too. My information in Poplar obviously is dated. I worked on it back in 2000, in late 90s to 2000. But one thing unique about Poplar is it is a thick fill. Catherine alluded to that. So when you deal with thick fill, the range of consolidation is big, and the time to reach 90% consolidation is long. So when you are planting a site with a variable elevation, in this case, a wetland creation or restoration, that gets tricky very quickly. So, and that's where the beauty of Poplar, like Catherine alluded to, learning from one cell to the next and adjusting for it. So there's a whole lot of science that neither of us got into in Poplar that we could talk days about, how to do the sediment modeling. And the reason I go there, Tom, is because there are two sides to this, right? One, the elevation is dropping because of consolidation. On the other side, the water levels are increasing with sea level rise. So consolidation, I feel like, is easy to predict. You can do one-dimensional testing. I know Adriana wanted us to go into data, so I'm going to go there a little bit. So I would say get the material properties not on a big project. Not only the borrow side or the dredge channel, but even week to week, month to month variation is important. So you know where to pump the sand, where to pump the silt. They both will perform differently in terms of consolidation. And that's important if you only have a foot tidal range to play with. So all of that connect, you can then take the one-dimensional analysis and put a 3D tin on it, and then you get the surface to play with. The problem I have with sea level rise, to go there, is because even when you look at the low, medium, high scenario, we have no idea where we are. So the best scenario is to have a local gauge, ideally at least 15, 20 years of data. If you don't have that, then we look at what is closest, but ideally something that that is in the vicinity that we can use as a benchmark. And then we pick the scenario, and my feeling is that if we are in the 50 to 100 year range, it's very likely we'll miss the mark, and this could be debated. So that's why I always look at these as an adaptively managed project. So my feeling is you have the thin layer placement approach. So what if you're off by half a foot? You can always come back and do a TLP on it. So that's, again, I'm not answering you directly, but it's sort of like I would say a, kind of iterative kind of analysis, and it depends on what your risk tolerance is. And I feel like sea level rise can easily be addressed through adaptive management. So that's my take.
And if I could add something onto that, Ram, I think that the long term, we need to be thinking programmatically rather than project by project. And that in fact, the whole coastal zone of New Jersey needs to be managed. The wetland system needs to be managed. This is not a site by site thing. There may be sites that are particularly damaged that need to have attention. That's true, and we can identify those. But the overall system also needs to be managed for sea level rise. And the idea that these are once and done projects, from a state perspective, that's not the way I look at it. I think of these projects as the whole system needs to be adaptively managed, and that we need to be thinking about coming back through on a regular basis to keep up with sea level rise. I mean, this problem isn't going away, and it's not going to all of a sudden abate. We're going to be needing to deal with it for decades, and if we're going to keep our coastal communities.
Yeah, and along those lines, I mean, there's the twofold objective, right? The one is that we need to have a marsh now, right? So we got to put it at a range that is going to accommodate that vegetation. We're going to have vegetation now, and if we, we're not necessarily looking 2-3 years now, but 50 years from now or whatever it might be, that may be a very different range. And to Scott's point, somewhere along the way, we may say, hey, we got to throw another few inches out there. The upside of this whole collaboration is, guess what? We're dredging that channel every 5 years. So does it need more now? Does it not? How do we place it there? Do we do it thin so we don't need to place plantments? But, it really comes back down to that programmatic thing. This first pass at every site is going to be, this marsh right now might be 2 feet below where we need it. So let's get that 2 feet on. But now, next time around, to Ram's point, it might just be a thin application or something like that. So there's restoring the baseline from what we've lost already and then carrying it forward from there.
Tom, you're muted.
Yep.
Sorry. So Scott, that's a good point about looking at a system-wide approach to marsh management as opposed to project by project, but how is that permitted? We talk about specific projects, and Chad mentioned, the permit may need to change even before you start your work. But how do we get to a point where adaptive management is included in these projects?
Well, I think adaptive management is included in the projects on a project by project basis based on the goals of that particular project and site. And I think we're going to be there for a little while. But I just want to draw attention to everybody that that's not the long-term sustainable way. Project by project just isn't going to be sustainable either for the marshes or for the navigation program. So in the long run, we're going to have to figure out how to do this in a sustainable, cost-effective manner that allows us to be able to manage the entire system as a system. That's coming. I don't know if permit is the right answer. It's policy and planning and thinking about managing this valuable resource that we have here in New Jersey.
I'd just like to add that one thing that it seems that everybody can get behind is a diverse habitat, diverse topography. So maybe larger portions of upland or high marsh that will eventually turn to low marsh with sea level rise and then you can come back and maybe raise more grade in the lower lying areas will help. But that's just that, as Scott said, that's more of a policy and an overall outlook. But I know that I've seen support for that in some of my projects where we're talking about it and want more diversity as opposed to just that pristine low marsh green carpet that looks so pretty. So I think diversity and elevation range and a tolerance for, while we all know that, you know, high marsh or too high could result in invasive species, I think there needs to be a little bit more tolerance in those upper level vertical tolerances to initially, because we all know that, you know, eventually it will consolidate or it may, or the underlying material may settle. So I think there's a bit of forgiveness there, but it is a policy type view that will help address this issue.
So I do see we have a hand up, so maybe I'll jump over to Jim. Jim, do you want to come off mute and ask a question?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, so yeah, I'm Jim Turk. I work for NOAA's Restoration Center up in, well, I work out of Rhode Island. I cover primarily southern New England, you know, for the most part. And so, well, first I'll respond to the last comment, and I would agree that, you know, for at least some of the projects or most of the projects we've done more recently, we have tried to have that variability, you know, in elevation to get a broader range that we're not tying ourselves down to the, you know, the percentage of, you know, regularly versus irregularly flooded conditions, but we're trying to get a range. We're trying to think longer term. And so, at least from my perspective, you know, we want to try to go as high as we can with the understanding that, you know, the plant community that is either, well, the plant community that basically develops, you know, may not be the perfect marsh that it is, you know, in 5 years, but in 10 years or 20 years, it may become exactly what we want it to be, you know, in terms of eco services and so there's trade-offs. And so I think that would be my response to that one is certainly we would have a range, you know, for, as an example, the Quanticottag pond project that we did in Rhode Island. We certainly, and NOAA funded it, whatever, partially funded it at like almost $1 million. We all agreed as partners to have the positive drainage. We make sure we had, you know, that variation in slopes. I know, you know, Wendley, Ferguson, and others, you know, worked diligently on ensuring that we had that drainage to prevent, you know, water pooling where we started building up release of sulfides. Although we didn't have the material that we actually dredged from the pond channel was rather coarse grain, and it really wasn't a sulfidic material problem. But the issue is when you put that dredged soil onto the marshes that basically are, you know, degrading and material, and so you're releasing sulfides, or in essence sulfuric acid, and that's where we get toxicity, plant toxicity. So, you know, we're trying to get that water off, you know, the system, and therefore having some kind of channel or drainage that requires longer term, you know, adaptive management practices over time. It seems like it's essential. But the other question I wanted to ask was relating back to the timing, you know, aligning the placement with the source issue. And I don't work in New Jersey, and I'm just curious, I don't know if Katie was answer this or someone else, but What have you guys done down that way to better try to do just that, to basically well plan for the availability of good material that, you know, is not, hopefully not problematic with sulfitic material? And so how are people or organizations or partners doing their diligence at trying to come up with better aligning placement versus source? I'm curious as to what you guys have done so far. It's a challenge, you know, anywhere we go, but I'd be happy to hear what you're doing.
Anyone want to take that question first, or do we
Who
have that?
do you want to do it, Tom?
Well, we'll start with you, Scott, if you want to.
Yeah, well, I can say that what we're doing in New Jersey, we just started a regional sediment management planning effort with resource agencies, transportation agencies, and resiliency, community resiliency groups to try to do just that, to align project restoration needs with navigation needs and community resiliency needs. So I think we're starting that process. We're hoping that that works out. Basically, going through data collection and stakeholder viewpoints right now. And over the next year, we're going to be working on assembling that information and trying to come up with a framework or a plan that, you know, it's not the Corps' regional sediment management planning process, which is somewhat defined. This one's a little bit more open-ended, looking at trying to address partially that same question, but also looking at what are some of the impediments, what are some of the difficulties that we're having, and trying to get consensus on what the policies should be for managing the resource overall. I don't know if that answers your question, Jim, but that's what we're doing.
Yeah, well, that's a good start. I mean, as you might guess, I mean, with the infrastructure monies that's out there now, we've had 4 NOFOs out, you know, for this year, 2 of which are due. Well, one's due next Tuesday, and the other one for underserved communities is due in October. But those, of course, relate back to Saltmarsh work in particular. And so, you know, I've had multiple conversations with potential multiple applicants, and I've gone through a bunch of people over the last month just to have good conversations. And of course, the topic that is recurring is, yeah, well, we'd love to do this soil placement project, but we're not sure we're going to get the material. And, you know, we've talked about, hey, you try getting a hold of the Corps and see how they respond, blah, blah, blah. And they might offer a location where something might happen, you know, that comes relatively close to the site. But other than that, it just seems like we're still working haphazardly up this way anyway. I can't say that's occurring everywhere. Maybe I'm missing something, but I just think that we need to be doing a better job as good, you know, as good stewards, I think, and I'm part of the problem, I guess. But I appreciate that you are trying to get that framework together. I think it's extremely important. If you do get that put together, I'm sure there are other, you know, states or, well, states in particular that would certainly probably gain from that. So it's good to know that you're doing that.
Yeah, and Jim, the other thing that we run into up in New England, a couple of things. One is that just about every bit of dredge material, unless it's sand that can go on a beach, has to go to an offshore disposal facility. So we're not even really set up for doing hydraulic dredging up here for most part, other than county dredge, whatever it might be for sand.
Well, why does it have to? You just said it has to. Who says it has to?
It does. I mean, that's how most of those projects. I'm not saying it has to physically or, you know, conceptually, but that's where it all goes right now, right?
But why? Why?
You tell me, right? That's
Well,
we
you've got
have
federal.
to change that. That makes no sense.
right.
Yeah, Catherine could probably address this, but there is a federal standard issue that you know, right now, the least cost environmentally acceptable alternative for those areas of the country is offshore placement, and it's pretty tough to come up with a restoration project that is less equal or less expensive than offshore disposal. That's pretty much the cheapest thing out there. In New Jersey, we're saying that we have other goals, and so we're spending money outside of that, and we also aren't restricted by the federal standard, but the Corps is. So
It's a core project,
I think you need Monica to sort of talk about what Philly district is doing to address that.
But does the, just to finish that off, does the Corps, when they have to do their, benefit cost analysis, if there was another entity out there that had, matching or leveraging funds,
Mhm.
is that part of the equation, or they just make this ad hoc, or not ad hoc, but they make a decision based upon the flat outcome of what's the least expensive alternative without considering any other options like matching or leverage funds? Does anybody have an answer on that?
Catherine, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I know that to get past the federal standard issue, you typically have to have a specifically authorized project and a cost share partner and separate funds for that project. Like for Poplar Island, the federal standard is open water placement right near the Bay Bridge. And so that's what the federal O&M dollars that are used to dredge the navigation channels, they only pay for that material to be transported to the Bay Bridge area where it would be dumped if we didn't have our project and if it wasn't illegal in Maryland. So then the Poplar Island is specifically authorized, totally separate funding that is used to then transport the material from the federal standard location to the island. So it can be done if you have, another project and a cost share partner, but it's time consuming and difficult to get those things in place. And even for small projects, we often do have, this smaller project or this smaller community really wants dredge material, but the big issue is almost always transportation of the dredge material from where you're digging it to where they want to put it, because the Corps or some community is maybe digging out their marina or digging a small navigation channel. It's like your funding is really just for the dredging, and the community or whoever wants the material has to be willing to pay for it to come to their site, and they usually don't have that money. It'd be nice if there was maybe more funding available to transport dredge material to where it needed to go. Just thinking of the larger network.
And to add on to that, there was some chat point that I think Lori Staver pointed out. Maryland has a similar program as well. But I just wanted to mention the Corps, ERDC, the Engineering Research Development Center, has a program called the NIOT, which is a Natural Infrastructure Opportunities Tool. And as part of the Engineering with Nature program that I'm supporting them with, we are talking about expanding that network to include this kind of information. But the NIOT is basically focused on the natural infrastructure opportunities. So if you have a wetland, for example, they do list who is the person with the material and where could the site, which site could use that material. And then final point, when we do, to Catherine's point, when we do a logistical analysis, that's the first thing you do in the concept development phase. You look at the dredging site, you look radially where the ideal sites are, which is a low-cost site, which is the best environmental benefit site, and what that delta is. And then you get into that cost discussion, who may, takes care of which cost.
Well,
again,
not to belabor.
Yeah, from the timing standpoint, you got to do that well ahead, right? Like if you're going to have a cost share on the side, and really part of what any regional network or planning is going to look at is, here are the channels that get maintained periodically, right? And so then other project partners, other potential cost share communities, whoever they might be, can say, typically this channel gets managed every 5 years or 10 years or whatever it is. So by the time next time comes around, I need to have my project permitted. I need the funding that's going to offset whatever the cost would be for them to stick it in a CDF or drop it offshore or pump it to the Bay Bridge or whatever it might be. So the knowledge is there, the data points are there. It's really just putting that all together so that we're, when the dredge comes around the next time, it's ready to roll.
And we also are in New Jersey, have such a large network spread over so much area. And there are places where I don't have any alternatives. This is the alternative. So it is the least cost environmentally acceptable alternative if I can get it designed and permitted, because I have nothing else. So that's somewhat of a unique situation. So I don't know if most navigation systems have a long-term management option available to them, and that's where you get into this funding conundrum. But I think the big piece that needs to be done that has not been done is reevaluating the cost benefit of this, that the green infrastructure has value, and our coastal communities have value, and they need
That's exactly
green
right.
infrastructure.
That's what I was going to ask, is why wouldn't we come up with a different way to value the benefits from putting that material in the right place? Because if you're saying that marsh or other resilient, that nature-like based project could be providing millions of dollars of value. And so how could you just say, well, it's cheaper to just dump it over, on that coral reef over, 28 miles out or whatever? That makes zero sense to me. I mean,
Right. It doesn't make any sense, Jim, but the problem is the course somewhat hamstrung by the legal framework under which they are forced to operate. I mean, they can't make that decision on their own. New Jersey, like I said, made that decision as a policy decision that was made up high up in government. We're not getting that kind of initiative. Although I would say that the last month at WIDA, which is the Western Dredging Association meeting in Houston, there were a lot of people talking about this very issue. So it's coming.
Yeah, I think that might be a broader topic for in-depth discussion in another webinar, because just discussing OMB's views of cost benefit could take this whole time, right? So I want to note that Adriana did put a quick note in the chat that please put your questions in the chat if you want to ask any questions for the panelists, or raise your hand like Jim did. And as you're thinking of your questions, I can ask one more to the panel. And that is, again, the timeline between design and construction. Oftentimes, and I know you've all mentioned flexibility in your comments, but in some instances, the site conditions change quite significantly between those 2 points of time. Have you faced challenges with these types of projects you have your design in place, and then when you get to the point where you have your permit and go to construction, the physical conditions have changed, and you need to alter your designs, and how is that done?
And ideally you design it so that you don't have that, but I think we are never in an ideal world. So I think we always have it. So that's where you can either go back and redesign the project or update it, or you can hire a smart contractor and work with the contractor to implement the project. I favor the second approach. In my projects, and not just in one region, throughout the nation, what we do is, if the bathymetry is off, we use the pre-con bathy as the baseline, and we negotiate with the contractor that there's a one-to-one change up to certain cubic yards. If it is significant change, then you need to renegotiate unit cost. And then likewise, if the placement site, there we don't normally have that big of an issue, but sometimes you could. If the wetland has degraded significantly, you may need more material in a certain area. So that gets more tricky than the dredging site issues.
Yeah, and following up on that, it's standard practice, I know, for Scott's projects, core projects as well, as they bid it with the most recent bathymetric that they have, and then we request a BD survey before we start dredging, as close to start of dredging, because that just fits the accurate measurement and payment. On the placement side, I mean, Narrow River was an example of that. They had a mapped area and quantity coming out of it, and we started in the middle and filled up as much of the area of the marsh to the design grades as we could, but that's the flexibility on the placement side of it. But yeah, universally, the dredge channel is going to be different than what it was initially solicited at, and it's a unit price type thing.
Yeah, following on to that a little bit is in the permitting phase is typically try and permit a conservative footprint. So something that's reasonable, but to have available areas if the dredge quantity either greatly increases or greatly reduces, you permit the area or your project with a conservative but reasonable footprint, so that you know what you can work with and have enough contingency, if you will, for your design when you get closer to actual construction, when you do your before dredge and your pre-construction surveys to assess the best assess the site conditions, how it's fair to the contractor and still have flexibility in your design and still be able to place it in a permitted area.
Yeah, Mike, that's a great point on certainly on the maximum side, because if you need to clear a channel and you run out of room in your placement area, that's a big problem. If you end up with a little bit less material than you need, not so much a problem, but if you haven't cleared the channel and you don't have a place to go with the rest of it, that's a really big problem.
Sure.
Yeah, I think Chad's comment brought me back to a common criticism we get in the permitting world, which is, I think if you are truly restoring a project, the restoration project should take precedence, and the dredging project becomes a source of material. If you are designing a dredging project, then the wetland site becomes a placement site, at which point the resource agencies gets very antsy with respect to, is there a need for restoration? Is the system degraded? Or are you just placing or dumping the material onto the site? So there is a big distinction in how you approach that project, and a lot of your parameters will change. If you are looking at a dredging project, you'll have to show in your analysis that there was no other acceptable option that was less impactful environmentally and more cost effective than going to this wetland site. If it's the other way around, then we just need to show that how much material is needed and where you're getting the material from to restore, and how you would assure that the site has been restored through an extensive monitoring program.
So through that comment, you always present the second alternative, which is it's a restoration site first, right?
Right. Yeah, the only reason I went there, Chad, was because so in a restoration project, if you assure a certain acreage, it's hard to back away from that for lack of material. So we need to balance it closely.
That's a great point. And we recently heard in a meeting from the Philadelphia District permitting side, making your case as why this marsh is degraded is very, very important to obtaining a permit. And so along those lines, the baseline data is critical. And in your experiences, are we missing certain baseline parameters when we approach projects, or what would you like to see collected to help make that case and make better designs? What do you wish you had in terms of data, I guess is the question.
That's a loaded question, Tom. So I think it's an interesting question, and maybe what makes it more complex is the fact that which resource is more valuable than the other, right? So is open water better than a marsh? Is a marsh better than a beach? Is a beach better than an island? So I think we get differing read in different parts of the country. I was going to mention that one of the programs I think our mid-Atlantic states should look to is Mississippi, which has 100% BU mandate. So any project, anytime you dredge in Mississippi, you have to first show that there is no beneficial use alternative if you're going to take it upland, which I thought was beautifully crafted. And then the close second to that is what the Corps as an organization, the national goal of the Catherine, I may mess this up, so you feel free to correct me, but 70 by 2030, 70-30 or something like that. 70% of the material should be beneficially reused core nationwide by the year 2030 or something like that. And Catherine will correct me in a second if I'm off. But anyway, coming back to this question, I at a minimum, I would say is extensive transects that show in a wetland system, how not only the bathymetry or topography is varying, but also the species abundance and diversity is varying. We do get into this question depending on who the Fish and Wildlife reviewer is an open, I would look at a wetland, and if you see sea level rise, the point you mentioned, Tom, and you look at 20, 30 years of data, look at Delaware Inland Bays, for example, you see marshes are drowning. So there's a convincing case to be made that those pools should perhaps be filled and converted back to productive wetland systems. Not always, sometimes people like pools, and there's this debate, how much should we fill, and is the resulting habitat more valuable or less valuable than the existing habitat? So it's a tricky question that could be debated at a very site-specific basis. Even within states, I've seen contradictory reads on permits. But at a minimum, I would say the bathy or topography, transect-based information. You do want to know where the invasives are, like Phragmites. You do want to know their circulation, if there is ponding areas, if there's lack of inundation. So we would want to know. I think Jim or somebody else earlier mentioned, or maybe it was Catherine, I believe, like the channeling is important. So you want to know through a reference marsh analysis, the marsh surface area to channel surface area. And that's where we define the primary channels and secondary channels post-construction. And then the geotechnical aspects, the marsh bearing capacity, the grain size. Now, and people forget about the placement side often. You do think about it in the dredging scenario, but it's important to understand the placement side, because that substrate can consolidate when you put material. So those are some of the things that come into my mind at the top of my head.
I think if I can add to that, one of the things that we definitely are collecting on all of our sites now is enough information to be able to perform a good hydrologic model, to produce a good hydrologic model of the site. We want to know how the site ebbs and floods on every tidal cycle, and also how that is likely to affect post-placement movement of material. So we want to be able to show the resource agencies, okay, here is the situation today and why we think this is a problem. And then what our proposed placement is in elevations and how that's going to affect the post-placement hydrology. So that ability to show that okay, here's where we are now, here's where we plan on going, and obviously this is a better scenario. That's one thing. The other thing is to do the coastal engineering analysis of waves and currents, so that we can understand most of our marshes are being destroyed from the outside in. There is some internal damage that's occurring and subsidence, but there's also this almost glacial calving that's going on, where we're losing large pieces of marsh right off the edge, and it's happening in some places in meters per year of loss of edge of our marshes, and that's completely unacceptable. But the only way to really address that is to have some understanding of what the conditions are out there that are causing it. We know sea level rise in general, but specifically on this site, what's going on. So you can design a stabilization mechanism for the shoreline, whether it's a dune or even rock revetment, to be able, an armoring, in order to be able to protect that from future erosion. Because there's no sense of putting the material up there if it's just going to come back right back into the channel.
Jim, you have another question, comment?
Yeah, I was just going to go back to a few of the statements that Rem had a little bit earlier. So one way to look at the the habitat issues with open water and changing conditions. I mean, certainly, for example, the USGS has done a lot of work with the unvegetated to vegetated ratio, and they've done a lot of stuff along the coast. And so we have some of that information already. And in my opinion, that should be taken into account to start looking at areas that, essentially you have areas that may be too far gone, and you may have areas that are starting to show indications and maybe more favorable for putting soil placement. So I think we should be looking at some of those those data that already are available to better understand the habitat quality issues, relating back to whether it's essential fish habitat or other factors. So that's all I would say with that. The other point I want to add, like Ram said, was placement capability, where you've got shear strength data that really go back to those areas that you're thinking about placement. Because what I have seen is, there's some places that look good to place material, but when you get out there, they're so degraded that you can envision, we're going to have some tough time trying to address the load issue. Some of these marshes we have in southern New England are toast. I mean, literally, and it'd be foolish to to try to spend money in prioritization. At least if we said we only got so much material available, they should go to places that are, in essence, not too far gone. That's all I would say. So, whoever's doing work on sites, I believe we do need to have shear strength measurements. And I've had a great opportunity to work with NRCS in Connecticut. Jacob Islib and others there have done a great job, and us, going out and characterizing these sites for, shear strength measurements. You can buy a unit, for $400 or $500 and have people go out to collect these data.
Good points, Jim. You mentioned essential fish habitat. That's another topic that usually gets some debate, whether an eroded island remnant is more valuable as an essential fish habitat. So these restoration programs almost always require that analysis. And one thing that perhaps is lost is the fact that the wetlands are quite valuable functional nurseries, and that equation is often neglected in this whole analysis. I often point to the case study of the Delaware Bay restoration back in the in the 80s, that did very extensive studies looking at what is 1 acre of wetland worth as a nursery compared to fisheries. So I think that's another point to consider. But to make another point to the viewpoint that Scott mentioned, the hydrodynamics as well as the geotechnical surface modeling are quite important, and they're also only as good as how we set up the models. So there's a lot that goes into modeling, whether that's circulation or coastal processes or sediment consolidation, and we could be off quite easily if the models are not set up correctly or if they're not calibrated properly. So just a bit of caution there.
Yeah, you mentioned modeling, Ram, and the question that our group has pondered on and off over the last year is, in modeling, do you think there's a difference in the way the marshes respond in a temperate region versus the Gulf, where the growing season is year-round, versus here we have a window of growing season and then kind of a dormancy? Do you think the processes are different, or are they fundamentally the same?
That is an excellent question, and I haven't looked into that. So I don't know. I often wonder how we account for the roughness in the vegetation when you set up these models, in terms of resiliency, but I have not looked into the growth patterns. That's an excellent point. I don't know if anyone else has looked at that.
Certainly an area, I think, of future research for sure.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we have looked at, as I think about it, and indirectly, we have looked at if you were to put thin layer placement of dredged material not exceeding 1 foot, how would the marsh respond? So it's not technically a coastal modeling evaluation, but we've looked at an ecological evaluation. What we have found is, regardless of where the marsh is, whether it's in the north or in the south, Typically, we used to say the marsh takes about 2 growing seasons for it to restore. And so this is without planting. And it is applicable whether it's a northeast marsh or a southern marsh. 2 growing seasons to come back. Recent data, and this data that I just mentioned is about a dozen or so data that they collected between the 80s and early 2000s, looking at mostly southern marshes, which was then augmented recently with the northern marshes. And so we have shifted our analysis to say it usually takes anywhere from, I would say, 2 to 4 growing seasons. So we have expanded the band, and that's because of how many rhizomes and seeds and all that you have in the existing marsh. And depending on that, the marsh revegetates. So from an ecological restoration perspective, both systems, regardless of temperature, bounce up pretty good, so long as you keep the thickness less than 1 foot. And there's a question in the chat. I saw somebody remarking, all these discussions about thickness, bear in mind there's a 6-inch over dredge or over placement that the dredger needs to have. And that's a fair point. So you could consider that an allowance for sea level rise, or something else. And finally, I do want to come back to the point Jim mentioned in passing. The marsh migration corridor analysis is quite interesting in the context of sea level rise. So when we looked at Cape Henlopen here, just randomly, just to see how that state park would change in Delaware, it was very interesting to see the marsh does migrate naturally landward, right? So the question is, do you attack it and defend it on the front end, or do you conserve it on the back end by making sure those properties are not privately held and they are available for the marsh to migrate? Is another intriguing question I think we should think about in the whole scheme of conservation.
Thank you, Ron. Any other thoughts on that? Jim, if you have one quick question, we can throw it in here. We do, Adriana.
I would just say, I would very quickly, just to respond to what Ram just said, my experiences in all the stuff that I've done over the years, my feeling is if you're not planting a site, typically, really getting a plant community established, coalesced, it's more going to happen at a scale of like 5, maybe 7 growing seasons. You really start to see, a good community, and that's the plant community cover. When we're talking about ecological, faunal changes and whatnot, that typically, has been pretty well documented that we're talking, 1 to 2 decades. And so, you got to put in perspective. And with going back to the plant community, I would say that the issues relate not only to the hydrology, but also like even the soil type. So we're talking about, coarser grain sand versus some finer material. Again, assuming it's good quality, non-sulfitic material, that plant community still may have a tougher time, in a droughtier condition, at a higher elevation than normal in a normal world. So those are all things to take into account. Nothing bad, but the timing is everything. Depends on the conditions that you end up creating.
Thanks. Thank you. Adriana, I'll send it to you, and you can take us out too.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. I really appreciate this discussion. So as to, I guess I'll ask one more question as the ecologist in the room, and representing, hopefully not misrepresenting, my numerous ecological colleagues that I see is on the participant list. So could each of you leave us with a final thought on a best rule of thumb or biggest lessons learned when it comes to engineering in a way that you can mimic natural systems? So kind of that key mimicking nature, engineering with nature feature. Because I find one of the biggest challenges for me as an ecologist, and I've learned a lot through engagement with all of you over the last couple of years of working on these types of projects, is the translation between the ecological data or the restoration side of things, or the habitat we want to see, and the how do we actually build it with the material that's available. And so I think that's really the crux of why I wanted to bring you all here today. And I'm still, like I said, still digesting, but just final thoughts from each of you on that, and then I will officially thank you and release everyone on time. Do I have to call on people? We'll go alphabetical order. Catherine, I think.
Okay, I think our final thought at Poplar Island is we're shifting towards, well, I was going to say we're shifting towards not over engineering everything, but then again we are trying to grade better to, you know, have the positive drainage and more gradual slopes. But we've also seen the value in having more varying elevations. You know, we've built hummocks, which are, you know, little high marsh locations within the high marsh humps inside the low marsh. And that's been really successful for habitat for different wildlife. And so I think we're trying to go more towards, you know, being creative with the various elevations and not big expanses of low marsh and big expanses of high marsh.
That's fantastic. Have you found any permitting challenges with kind of creating those? That's always the other piece, right? Is it buildable and then is it permittable?
Yeah, we've worked it out so that our permitting is locked in, but we're now convinced that it applies to the entire island. So within each little wetland area, we don't need to follow the exact percentages. So we have incorporated some flexibility that way.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine. All right. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, so Chad is next.
Yeah,
Forget my alphabet.
Yeah, I think there's a practicality and a reality of it is that it is mimicking a natural system, right? Because natural systems have established over centuries and centuries of accretion and accumulation of organic material and everything else, and we're not going to make that. So we're working with the materials that we've got on a macro level. If we're trying to, you know, as I was talking about earlier, catch up to what's degraded or fallen behind, then we're going to make the best shot we can. Some of the features that Catherine spoke about in terms of having positive drainage, so we're not impounding water that's going to inhibit vegetation, maintaining that edge, understanding that vegetation stops growing below a certain elevation. We need to have some component of the design that's going to keep it there is an important consideration. Looking at what your now versus future state objectives are important considerations. For the most part, as a contractor, some of what we're being measured on is whether we've established a marsh, and some of what a project owner or proponent or partner is going to be measured on from a permitting standpoint is why isn't your vegetation growing because you shot for a high marsh for 50 years from now, but it's only now. So some of that part of it. And then once we are in that state, there's the potential to consider mimicking natural processes as well. And that's where we start looking at, you know, we've done such a good job with erosion and sediment control and upland development that we're not getting the accretion out in marshes in the depositional areas that we once did. So maybe beneficial reuse in a thin layer or spray type placement can mimic that natural process and allow those things to continue.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So Mike, really quickly, and then Graham.
Yeah, I don't know if I could offer much in terms of the mimicking of natural processes, but I know that what's helpful is making the involving the entire team, all the stakeholders, you know, the ecologists, the hydrologists, geotechnical survey, the design engineers, the regulators, involve them early and often and be completely transparent in what you're trying to achieve and be honest in what you think you can construct. And what some of the project constraints are. You'll never make everybody happy, but hopefully you can make everybody a little happy. So I know it doesn't really answer your direct question, but you know, we're engineers and we're just a small part of the entire design process and outcome. So to be as most informed as possible each step of the way and have everybody at least at that same level of information as the design progresses usually ends up, at least it manages expectations going forward in trying to achieve a successful project.
Absolutely. Well, I know I'm looking forward to working with you on the Lighthouse Center project in that same capacity. So I'm
Me
proud of our
too, thank you.
multidisciplinary team. Ram, if you're still with us real quick.
Sure. I would say, develop sustainable design. So as engineers and scientists, we can design and build anything, but the rule of thumb is look into nature. If a nearby marsh doesn't function in that kind of variability, then the chances are we'll spend a lot of money maintaining that in O&M mode. So I would say, where possible, minimize prescriptive design, go for performance design, and be adaptable during construction, and then tie your monitoring to clearly defined success criteria so everybody's happy at the end of the day.
I really
Thank you.
appreciate that. Yeah, performance criteria. Well, thank you all for participating. I really appreciate our panelists for taking the time to share their wide range of expertise with us. I appreciate my facilitation team. So Laura behind the scenes, Laura Kerr and Stevens Institute, and Tom Harrington as moderator, and of course the Beneficial Use Learning Network Organizing Committee. I really appreciate our participants also prioritizing this during what I know is a busy field season for everyone. The recording will be provided. I'll shoot that via email. It'll be on the New Jersey Coastal Resilience Collaborative website. So they've graciously offered our regional learning network a New Jersey digital home. So we can all access the recordings from previous webinars. I posted the link earlier in the chat, but I'll make sure that that's in our follow-up materials, and I'll also be sharing out the slides that our presenters, I know that was packed with a ton of information that we'd all like to sit with and digest. So I appreciate that. My final words will be to plug our next webinar, which is already coming on September 21st, hopefully at 1 p.m. So look for that, save the date, coming out soon. It will be focused on the next phase, which is construction and adaptive management. Many of the themes we've already heard about from today's speakers. So we may be asking